dry land is called Eretz, called earth. So it's descriptive of continents. Now, there's a theory that there was perhaps one continent in the original creation. Some have described it as Pangaea. And here's a scenario that some suggest because of the possible linkage between Africa and South America and perhaps even America, and how perhaps Europe and Asia at one time could have been one continent. And it includes India, Australia, and Antarctica on this little slide there. It's possible. Obviously, you can't really know what it was like before the flood, because the flood basically wiped out everything. At least that's our viewpoint. Eventually, the continents, we would see them as post-flood, the continents as they exist today. And we know a lot from plate tectonics, because we see movements today, tectonic movements. And we would have to say, as young Earth creationists, that after the flood, there was probably continental sprint to form the continents as they exist today. So we can't really project back as to and be certain as to the layout of the geography of the planet before the Genesis flood. But it does suggest and gives the possibility of one continent. And I'll leave that at that. Now, there's a lot of passages, well, not a lot, there's a few passages that suggest, and it gives the idea that there's something important about what God is doing here. And I think it's assurance, because these are passages after the flood, and Noah certainly, and perhaps humanity, needs assurance that the continents are going to survive, especially after a flood event. One passage, for example, in Jeremiah 5:22, speaks of this boundary that is set up for the oceans and the waters. Do not fear me, declares the Lord. Do you not tremble in my presence, for I have placed the sand as a boundary for the sea. So there's an assurance. An eternal decree, which is an interesting, strong statement. So it cannot cross over it. Though the waves toss, yet they cannot prevail. Though they roar, yet they cannot cross over it. Now, these boundaries are initially set. In fact, I made a big point of God creating categories. Remember we talked about that in the separation of light and darkness. We think in categories. We understand by and relate to the world we live in by categories. Not only light and darkness, but now land and sea. So we have these boundaries that are set up, and we're assured that these boundaries will continue. So God assures us that when we go to science, there's some consistencies there, that we can count on certain things, and this is one of them. Though the waves toss, yet they cannot prevail. Though they roar, yet they cannot cross over it. So we have the beginning of that on day 3. Proverbs 8:27 and 29, and a similar passage speaking of wisdom. When he established the heavens, I, wisdom is speaking here as a woman, I was there. When he inscribed a circle on the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, referring to the creation here, when the springs of the deep became fixed, when he set for the sea its boundary, so that the water would not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth. So other passages kind of reinforce what God is saying on day 3. So a couple passages there. So after the naming that we have in verse 10, the latter part is the assessment. And we've seen, again, stress on that, where God assesses his work. In verse 10, God saw that it was good. Now that also suggests completion. In other words, it's finished. It's done. It's completed. It was good. It's not incomplete. It was good, suggesting the immediacy of fulfillment that I've already mentioned. So that's verse 10. Now, I mentioned in the introduction also that there's, I think, an intentional polemic or an intentional argument by Moses against the cultures in which the children of Israel would have contact in their day. Remember, they came out of Egypt. I mentioned that relationship in the introduction to this series. And I mentioned that they were going to go into a culture of the Canaanites. They would also have contact with the culture of the Babylonians. All of these other cultures had worldviews that were different from the biblical worldview. They also had a theology. They also had a viewpoint in relationship to the gods. One of the things that they had was this mixing of the creation with their gods. But there were some other elements. I think on day 3, we have an intentional argument against all of those theologies, all of those worldviews, all of those pagan mythologies. And there's little hints here. We've already seen one of them. When it refers to the seas, it talks about here in Genesis, God is the one that puts them in one place. Now, there seems to be evidence in the Scriptures because there's many references to Rahab in the biblical text. And we wonder, well, what's that reference to Rahab? What's going on there? And what are the passages that refer to Rahab? For example, I think I've got one here on the text. One of them is Psalm 74:13, referring to God, you divided the sea by your strength. Notice again, an allusion to Genesis 4. You broke the heads of the sea monsters in the waters. An allusion to these sea monsters or Rahab. There's other passages refer to Leviathan. Some of these were associated with myths of ancient peoples. And what Genesis is telling us, and passages like Psalm 74:13, God is sovereign over all of these so-called gods. God is sovereign over the magnificent and great oceans. Nothing gets by the power and sovereignty of God. Everything is in submission to the Almighty God. These so-called sea monsters, this sea, fit within God's sovereign plan. So they're not to be feared. They're not anything unusual. God is sovereign over them. These, as part of mythology, were creatures that were feared and creatures that had an impact on these ancient peoples. And perhaps they may even be allusions to actual creatures that existed long ago. So we have these myths. Psalm 89:10, you yourself crushed Rahab like one who is slain. You scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. So God is sovereign over all of these mythological, perhaps based on reality, but mythological legends that existed amongst the children of Israel. Another passage, Isaiah 51:9-10, awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord, awake in the days of old. The generation of long ago, was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? So I think these passages, along with even Genesis, that speaks of God creating the oceans or setting the boundaries of the waters of the ocean, are arguments or polemics against these creatures that came out of the sea. So we have the Lord of the seas. Rahab was the Lord of the seas. We also have, there were also in Enuma Elish, the flood story, or not the flood story, the creation story of the Babylonians, which predates Genesis. So Moses didn't copy the ideas from Enuma Elish and the Babylonians. Instead, what Moses is doing is he's giving the inspired revelation the correct viewpoint of how things came about. So rather than this primordial earth that is alluded to in Enuma Elish, we have God sovereignly creating the oceans and the earth. Thirdly, there are many seasonal myths that are cyclic, that are tied to the gods that existed amongst the Canaanites, which the children of Israel would reside amongst later on when they conquered the land of Canaan. And again, all of these myths concerning fertile vegetation, which we'll look at in a moment, I think there's at least a subtle hint God is the creator of not only the seasons, we'll see that on day 4, but God also is the author of fertility because he's the one that creates all of plant life and all of animal life. So we have these ancient cultures, at least by way of hint, that are argued against in actually day 3 of Genesis chapter 1. Then we have all the fertility cults. One of them, of the Canaanites, is Baal, who was the god of fertility. Baal would die at the end of the season, kind of picturing the dying of crops and plants as it goes into the winter season. And then Baal would be revived, picturing the springtime when plants. So the whole cycle is tied to these gods of the Canaanites. And I think Moses is telling us God is sovereign over all of that. So none of that is true. None of that is accurate. So we have a subtle hint against the ancient cultures. Now that was applicable to Moses' day and the children of Israel that came out of Egypt with Moses. But I think, and I've mentioned in the introduction, that what we have in Genesis could have been written in our culture as well. And I think we have a polemic that applies to our day as well, as you will see on the outline sheet when we get to that point. Primarily a worldview that I'll mention in a moment. So day 3 continues. We've looked at verses 9 and 10. Now we have a second aspect of creation on day 3, creation of vegetation. That's verses 11 through 13. So let's look at them. First, again, to stress it, not just as a linguistic, artistic point, but in verse 11, or 12 rather, or 11 rather, then God said 2 times. Verse 9, then God said. Now again, then God said. And notice, I mentioned this, I think it was either last time or the time before that. It's a vav consecutive, and in the Hebrew, vav consecutive, we have sequential events. An important element of the historicity of this passage, or the evidence for its historicity, is the vav consecutive that is consistent throughout this passage. And that's what we have here. And, or then God said. In other words, this is the next event, the next in the sequence. Then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation. Now, interestingly, the verb there that's translated in New American Standard, sprout, is the identical term for vegetation, except it's in the verbal form. In Hebrew, you generally have 3 characters that make up the stem of most words, and by just pointing it differently, it will be pointed to be a noun or other parts of speech, or it can be pointed to become a verb, but it's the same word, and that's what we have right here. So actually, you could translate it, let vegetation vegetate, if you could say that, or let sprouts sprout, if you would.